So the theory of island biogeography really hinges on the idea that there are two major processes that shape ultimately the number of species that are going to be on an island. The number of species is going to be sort of set by these processes, but the identity of those species, what species are going to be there, could change over time. And that's why we use the term dynamic to describe the fact that the species that are there, the list of species, if you will, might change over time, although there's going to be an equilibrium where these processes balance out that's going to keep that number constant or relatively constant. Okay, and again, when we have a sense of what the rates are, if we have a higher rate of one thing or the other, this is going to influence what that equilibrium number will be. I'll sort of outline this in a moment, but just to give you a sense, this was sort of a conceptual idea that then launched a huge amount of research in the 1970s focused on testing different aspects of the theory. So let's go ahead and start with how the theory worked. And we can think of it as sort of a thought experiment, right? We can imagine that there is some mainland area that has a certain number of species, right? This is the pool of species that you have to choose from. And so that whole pool of species, if you're talking about all the species in North America, for example, if you're talking about an island off the coast of North America, or let's say all of the species available, off the coast of New Guinea as you get to those small islands, right? Then New Guinea would be sort of the continent or the source area. So they have this number P, which is, if you're on an island, going to be over here. That's the maximum number of species that you can hold on an island, because that's the maximum number of species that are in the area, right? Minimum number of species is 0. So the number of species on an island, which is going to be represented on this axis, is ranging from 0 all the way up to the maximum, okay? The second thing to consider here is that we can imagine, well, what if we could manipulate things so that there were no species on the island? If there were no species on the island, we could ask the question, well, how many species could arrive to that island, in other words, immigrate from the mainland area, right? And so if that number was very close to 0 or low, well, a lot of species could get there, meaning species would arrive, they wouldn't have any competition, it would be very easy to arrive and get established. As more species sort of build up on the island, of course, we're going to be moving in this direction, right? So that immigration rate is going to be high, but it's actually going to be moving things over here. When we get sort of lower, sort of further along, now not only are there fewer species to immigrate to the island, right, because a lot of them are already there, right? The definition of immigration, by the way, is a new species arriving that wasn't previously established on the island. The other thing, of course, is that there's competition going on, and it's harder for new species to get going on that island. By the time we get to all of the, imagine we could take all of the species, right? We get Noah's Ark together, take all the species, cram them on that island. It turns out that now there are no species left to immigrate, right? Not only that, but even if there were a few species, that weren't there, basically those species, are going to have a hard time getting established on this island with all that competition, okay? So that's sort of what's going on here. The axis, again, 0 species on an island up to the full species pool on the island is going to influence the immigration rate, right? Which is going to gradually go down the more species are on that island. Extinction is when a species, this isn't going extinct globally, this is just going extinct on that island, right? So local extinction. You can imagine if you've got an island and you cram all of the species on that island, well, there's going to be a lot of competition. Probably a lot of species aren't going to hack it. And so the extinction rate in that circumstance, if you could imagine that occurring, would be very, very high. And again, you can imagine some species going extinct and the island getting fewer and fewer species on it. Imagine the other extreme where there are no species on the island, right? Basically, there's very little competition. There's not a lot of extinction going on. Okay. Now we look at these two, the immigration versus the extinction. If we have very few species on the island, the immigration rate, that's to say the number of species coming in per year or per decade or whatever it is going to be much higher than the number of species going extinct. And so naturally, that's going to move the number of species up, right? If, on the other hand, we crammed all the species onto that island, the extinction rate is much higher than the immigration rate, and that's going to cause the number of species to go down. Whoops. There is, however, this magical spot, which is called equilibrium, where the number of species is at a number where the immigration rate equals the extinction rate. We do have a few things coming in. We do have a few things going extinct, but the number of new species being established is the same number as the number of species going extinct. And this is what we call equilibrium. It's a dynamic equilibrium because we might have a species go extinct and then a different species immigrate, and now we have a different group of species on that island, even if the number of species is remaining the same. Now, what MacArthur and Wilson realized was that depending on whether it's a large island or a small island, that's going to influence these rates. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about immigration rate. If we have a large island, it's capable of catching a larger number of species, right? It's just a bigger target. Birds are going to see it. Plants are going to accidentally land on a bigger island, all else being equal, right? Whereas a smaller island, fewer species are going to immigrate. Similarly, on a smaller island, the extinction rate is going to be higher because there's less space on that island and because the competition is going to be more fierce. And so the extinction rate on a small island is always going to be higher than it is on a large island under similar conditions. And so when you look at the immigration rate for a large island and the extinction rate for a large island, you'll see that they're crossing over here at a larger number, right? Again, the number of species is on this axis, whereas that smaller island where the immigration rate line and the extinction rate line are intersecting is occurring at a lower number of species. And so that basically explains why we have a smaller number of species on a smaller island compared with a larger island. It's not just the amount of habitat, it's these processes of immigration and extinction and relating to what kind of competition is going on the island. It turns out that we also have a pattern when it comes to an island that is close to the mainland or far from the mainland. If the island is far from the mainland, of course, we're going to have a lower immigration rate than we would from an island that is very close to the mainland. The near island is going to have a higher immigration rate than the far island. However, the extinction rate is really only a function of area. And so if these two islands were the same area, the extinction rate would be the same. However, you'll notice that because the immigration rate is higher than for the near island than the far island, where it crosses that extinction rate line is happening at a larger number of species than it is for the far island. So the far island is going to have fewer species than the near island. So we can imagine, of course, and this is sort of setting up the reading that we have, that there are other processes going on. And this is easily sort of understood when we look at a place like the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa and the Hawaiian Islands, which are far in the middle of the Pacific. And these are two groups of islands that I've been studying with colleagues in the Canary Islands, where we're trying to understand these processes. Of course, there are other things going on these islands, particularly evolution. And we can talk about some of the other issues that this theory doesn't quite explain. But evolution is a really big one because this is something that really takes time. And so you can see the geologic ages of the islands are showing here, but also is related to some degree to some of these other processes like competition. So it certainly is related, and other theoretical ideas relating to islands have been building since the establishment of that equilibrium theory. Just to give you an idea, the Canary Islands are similar in size to the Hawaiian Islands. They just don't have an island quite as big as the Big Island. What is different about the Canary Islands is, though, that they are quite a bit older. They have these really old islands that are 15, 20 million years old that really have eroded down and are very flat. However, these other islands have mountains that are nearly as high as Mauna Kea and the kinds of mountains that we see in Hawaii. This is the highest mountain in Spain. These islands are part of Spain, after all. This is the highest mountain in Spain, and it's just a bit shorter than Mauna Kea. We also have a wide range of environments in these islands, right? So they have a full range of environments ranging from deserts to these sort of dry forest formation with these so-called dragon trees, which are actually related to our jalapepe trees. They have forests, these lush forests that are largely fed by fog, which is something we also have in Hawaii. And when we look at a species-area relationship in these two archipelagos, they're very, very similar. We see similar numbers of species in the Canary Islands, which are shown in green, and the Hawaiian Islands, which are shown in red, and the Hawaiian Islands, which are shown in green. You can see that we have the island of Hawaii, which is a little below the trend. And again, because we know that there's a relationship between evolutionary processes and time, now we can see that the Big Island has fewer species than we might expect based on area because it's a geologically young island. So there are lots of things that we can think about with these different processes, and the reading certainly will establish that we have different kinds of islands in different parts of the world. Hawaii and the Canary Islands are what we call oceanic islands. They're away from the mainland, and they emerged because of volcanic processes basically in the middle of the ocean. And so the dispersal processes are still the first part of the main process shaping the species that are on those islands. We also certainly have an extinction rate, but we also have a rate of species being added through evolution. And of course, when we look at the number of immigration, the immigration rate, I should say, from the mainland to the Canary Islands, of course, it's much higher than it is in Hawaii. However, because Hawaii has so much evolution going on, basically that's acting like immigration. It's bringing the immigration rate up in a sense by adding species through evolution, and that's why the Hawaiian Islands actually have nearly as many species as the Canary Islands. So that's one thing that, and we'll be getting into this later in the semester, talking specifically about the evolutionary process. Some islands, even though they're very isolated, evolution makes up for that shortfall in immigration due to isolation. And this is something that we wouldn't necessarily expect just based on the biogeography theory.